Okay, so we are now going to study the muscles of the tongue. We will study the muscles of the tongue with the help of the diagrams. Okay, let's start. Okay, so you can see here, this is the median fibrous septum. This is the medial fibrous septum. This middle fibrous septum, it divides the tongue into two halves, right half and left half. Each half contains 4 intrinsic muscle and 4 extrinsic muscle. There are two types of muscles in the tongue, intrinsic muscle as well as the extrinsic muscle. So this middle fibrous septum, it divides the tongue into left and right half, and each half contain 4 extrinsic muscle and 4 intrinsic muscles. Okay. Okay, so muscle of the tongue. You can remember by the mnemonic PEPC, that is the extrinsic muscle. The position of the tongue is altered by the extrinsic muscle and the shape of the tongue is altered by the intrinsic muscle. Okay, there are two types of muscle in the tongue, extrinsic muscle and intrinsic muscle. Extrinsic muscle, position of the tongue is altered and the shape of the tongue is altered by the intrinsic muscle. Okay, P is position, E for extrinsic, S is shape of the tongue, I is intrinsic. So you can remember by the mnemonic PEPC. Okay, so these are the muscles of the tongue, intrinsic muscle as well as the extrinsic muscle. There are 4 types of intrinsic muscle. First one is superior longitudinal muscle, inferior longitudinal muscle, vertical muscle and transverse muscle. What is the role of intrinsic muscle? Intrinsic muscle, the shape of the tongue is altered by the intrinsic muscles. They are inside the tongue. Okay, now we will understand all these 4 muscles with the help of the diagram. So remember the name of the intrinsic muscle: superior longitudinal muscle, inferior longitudinal muscle, vertical muscle and transverse muscle. Okay, you can see in this diagram all those 4 intrinsic muscle. This is the superior longitudinal muscle. You can see this arrow. This one is the superior longitudinal muscle. It lies beneath the mucous membrane. Okay, this is the superior longitudinal muscle. Second one is inferior longitudinal muscle. This is the inferior longitudinal muscle. You can see this is the inferior longitudinal muscle. This is our tongue. Okay, the third muscle is transverse muscle. This is the transverse muscle. And fourth is the vertical muscle, okay, present at the anterior of the tongue. So 4 types of muscle: superior longitudinal muscle, inferior longitudinal muscle, transverse muscle and the vertical muscle. Okay, these intrinsic muscle help in the alteration of the shape of the tongue. You can see here the intrinsic muscle, it occupies the upper part of the tongue and are attached to the submucous fibrous layer and to the median fibrous septum. We have seen the median fibrous septum in our diagram. Okay, what is its role? These intrinsic muscle alters the shape of the tongue. We have seen and we have remembered by the mnemonic PEPC. Okay, position is altered by the intrinsic muscle and the shape is altered by the intrinsic muscle. Okay, see now the 4 muscles. This superior longitudinal muscle, it lies beneath the mucous membrane. Inferior longitudinal muscle is a narrow bend lying close to inferior surface of the tongue between the genioglossus and the hyoglossus. Next we will see what are these muscles. Okay, the third muscle is the transverse muscle. It extends from the median septum to the margin. You can see here, you can see this transverse muscle. Okay, medium septum to the margin, it extends. And the last muscle is the vertical muscle. It is found at the border of the anterior part of the tongue. Okay, so we have seen all the 4 muscles with the help of the diagram. Now we are going to study the intrinsic muscle, which help in the alteration of the position of the tongue. Okay, now the extrinsic muscle, they are also 4: genioglossus muscle, hyoglossus muscle, styloglossus muscle and the palatoglossus muscle. Okay, दिस इज़ वेरी ईजी. आपको इनके नाम याद नहीं करने पड़ेंगे. अभी हम डायग्राम से जब समझेंगे तो इनके नाम ईजी हो जाएंगे. ओके, जेनियोग्लॉसस, हायोग्लॉसस, स्टाइलोग्लॉसस एंड पैलेटोग्लॉसस. Okay, we can see with the help of the diagram. Okay, so this is the diagram. The first muscle is the genioglossus muscle. This is our tongue. Okay, this is our tongue. This tongue, it is attached to the mandible. You can see in the diagram where is the mandible. This tongue is attached to the mandible with the help of the muscle that is known as the genioglossus muscle, which is the first extrinsic muscle. Okay, so tongue is attached to the mandible with the help of the genioglossus muscle. Okay, you can see this attachment also. This is the tongue and this is the genioglossus muscle. You can see the attachment. Then the second muscle is the hyoglossus muscle. This is our hyoid bone. This is the hyoid bone. Okay, so the hyoid bone, the tongue is attached to the hyoid bone with the help of the muscle that is known as hyoglossus muscle. Okay, the third is the styloglossus. So remember, this is the styloid process. You can see in the diagram. So the tongue is attached to the styloid process with the help of the muscle known as styloglossus muscle. Okay, we have completed 3 muscle. Now the 4th muscle is the palatoglossus muscle. This palatoglossus muscle, the tongue is attached to the palate with the help of the muscle known as the palatoglossus muscle. Okay, so once again we are going to revise it. First muscle, there are 4 extrinsic muscle which help in the alteration of the position of the tongue. The first muscle is the genioglossus muscle. The tongue is attached to the mandible with the help of the genioglossus muscle. The second muscle is the hyoglossus muscle. The tongue is attached to the hyoid bone with the help of hyoglossus muscle. The third muscle is the styloglossus muscle. Tongue is attached to the styloid process with the help of the styloglossus muscle. And the last muscle is palatoglossus muscle. The tongue is attached to the palate with the help of the muscle known as palatoglossus muscle. Okay, so remember all these 4 muscles and their attachment point. Okay, so now we are going to study the action. First we have seen the intrinsic muscle, 4: superior longitudinal, inferior longitudinal, transverse and vertical. This superior longitudinal muscle, it shortens the tongue and make the dorsum concave. Inferior longitudinal muscle, it shortens the tongue and make the dorsum convex. Remember, it is concave and inferior longitudinal is convex. Okay, then the transverse, it makes the tongue narrow and elongated. Vertical muscle, it makes the tongue broad and flattened. The most important is the extrinsic muscle. Their actions are very important. Genioglossus muscle, it protrudes the tongue. Hyoglossus muscle, it depresses the tongue. Styloglossus muscle, it retracts the tongue. And palatoglossus muscle, it elevates the tongue. Okay, so it's very important to remember the actions. Genioglossus muscle protrudes, hyoglossus muscle depresses, styloglossus muscle retracts, and palatoglossus muscle elevates the tongue. Okay. Okay, extrinsic muscle, there are four. Okay, the extrinsic muscle connects the tongue to the mandible via genioglossus, to the hyoid bone through hyoglossus, to the styloid process via styloglossus, and palate via palatoglossus. We have seen the diagram and we already understand this. Okay, concising the important points of the tongue. Middle fibrous septum, it divides the tongue into right and left half. Each half contains 4 extrinsic muscle and the 4 intrinsic muscle. There are two types of muscle, intrinsic muscle and the extrinsic muscle. The intrinsic muscle, there are 4: superior longitudinal muscle, inferior longitudinal muscle, transverse and the vertical. Extrinsic muscle are 4: genioglossus, styloglossus, hyoglossus and palatoglossus. The important point is this genioglossus muscle, it is also known as the safety muscle. You have to remember genioglossus muscle is also known as the safety muscle because it prevents the tongue from falling back while lying down, and that's why it is known as the safety muscle. If the tongue will fall down, what will happen? There will be glottis and it will get covered by the epiglottis, and there will be problem in difficulty in the breathing. Okay, so to prevent that, there is the genioglossus muscle. It prevents the tongue from falling back. Now the palatoglossus, and this genioglossus muscle, it is the largest muscle of the tongue. The second muscle is the palatoglossus muscle. The important point of the palatoglossus muscle is that it is not a true muscle of the tongue, as it is the muscle of the palate and tongue both. Okay, not exclusively the muscle of the tongue. So it is known as the false, that is not the true muscle of the tongue. So these two important points should be remembered. Genioglossus is the largest muscle of the tongue and is known as the safety muscle. Palatoglossus muscle is not a true muscle of the tongue, as it is the muscle of the palate and also the tongue. Okay. So thank you so much. In the next video, we will see the arterial, venous, lymphatic and the nerve supply of the tongue. The nerve supply of the tongue is very important. We will discuss in the next lecture.